Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, and Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire. Kieran, we're recording this on a Sunday, just before the Everton Man United game kicked off. So let's get it out. Did you have a nice time yesterday in the fair city of Nottingham?
Nottingham is a wonderful city. Yes, all good.
It is.
It's always good to get an away victory. It's a long time since we won a match, so quite exciting.
Yeah. Tell me about it. Yeah.
Well, you were positives, Kevin. You were first on match of the day.
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth, because if the match of the day executive who decides the running order is listening to this, you and I are going to have a word. Sunshine, whoever you are, because for the first time in living memory, Palace are first on match of the day with that. Yes. We beat Man City and we were fifth on match of the day, and there are only 4 games at that. It's just really, it's bad enough to know they're all Spurs fans at the BBC, except for the ones that are Brighton fans, and now there's obviously a Luton fan in amongst them. It's shameful. Kieran, as we said, we are recording this just before the Man United Everton game. I've got no doubt that the atmosphere will be febrile, I believe is the word we could use for that. But we do have a couple of questions about Everton. I suspect we will be saying that up and beyond and past the appeal, if it ever comes. I think there's going to be a lot of questions each week. The first question on Everton comes from Wayne Wardle. And Wayne says, if the overspend has mainly come in the form of interest payments and loans for the new stadium, how has that created an unfair sporting advantage? Or is it simply a case of it's irrelevant what the money was spent on, and it's still an advantage, hence the points deduction?
Yes, this formed part of Everton's defence, and you can understand where they're coming from. They won't be moving into the new stadium until 2025, in all probability, and therefore there is no sporting advantage in respect of them investing in future infrastructure. This was a strict interpretation of a rule by the Commission and the Premier League. It's difficult to get your head round why they've taken such a draconian approach, but it certainly increased Everton's losses and therefore had an impact upon the tariff that was given. The Commission concludes that it's not there as a sort of a moral arbiter in relation to how the money is spent, and that there are already exemptions given for what you might broadly consider to be virtue spending, in the sense of we do want improved facilities, so therefore that's okay. The community scheme, and I've said on many occasions, the Everton one is superb. We've had somebody from the Everton to talk about it, academy, and so on, and the women's team. So even if the Commission wanted to give a further exemption, it's effectively tied by the Premier League rules. There is also a case for, however, saying, should the Commission have taken that into consideration in relation to ultimately determining the penalty given to Everton, given that there are no hard and fast rules. And I think the Premier League has come in for some criticism, quite a lot of criticism, some of which is justified. And here I would say you've had the rules for 10 years and you've not got around to saying how we think that offences should be dealt with. Now, that's either because the clubs themselves can't agree and effectively have passed a buck, or nobody's thought of it, neither of which I think reflect well on the decision makers.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot this weekend, Kieran, the last couple of days, especially about people's opinions of what will happen when the appeal goes in, as it inevitably will. I can't say I agree with all. Martin Samuels at the Times, who's normally, even for an ex-Mail writer, is normally quite restrained, but seems to be arguing that FFP shouldn't be there in the first place, and that any club who has more money than the other should be allowed to spend it. But also, using it again as a stick to beat the Premier League and saying, well, this is, you might as well just give the game up to the government regulator. And again, that willful ignoring of the fact that it's an independent regulator, it's not a government regulator. So I'm really torn. My heart goes out to Everton fans, Kieran, but at the same time, Everton fans would expect other clubs to be punished if they were doing the same thing, as they will do with Man City. There's no doubt that Everton have blatantly infringed FFP regulations, and it shouldn't be the fans that are punished, but unfortunately that's the case. And the second and last question we have on Everton, Kieran, people like Jamie Carragher are very quick to throw words around like unprecedented, but of course his 10-point deduction is far from unprecedented, and fans of many other clubs have pointed this out, and one of them is a Palace fan, who I know, John Vince. As John Vince says, how does the 10-point deduction for Everton compare to Swindon's double relegation, Luton's 30-point deduction, and other cases? And are they comparable? And of course, Scottish fans will say, well, look what happened to Rangers. They got a double relegation as well, didn't they?
Yes. It's complicated. The more that you look into comparative cases, the less clarity you reach upon. In the case of Swindon Town, we are going back 30 years or so. They were promoted in the playoffs. I think they beat Sunderland, and then it was found that there had been a significant number of illegal payments to players. And this was a sort of a football association investigation more than the Premier League. So therefore, that's how they were able to be given effectively 2 relegations. Again, was that fair on Swindon fans? No, it's not. There's no doubt about that. In the case of Luton Town ended up with a 30-point penalty. That was on the back of 3 insolvencies. And in the sort of the old version of the EFL, and we said, I've been quite critical of the EFL a few years ago. I think it's a much better beast today. I think it's got people in there that understand finance and understand football and understand the law, who have far more senior positions. In the case of Luton, some clubs, and I'm not saying that Luton are amongst them, but some clubs, and you and I, who know who we're talking about here, deliberately had the owner put the club into an insolvency arrangement to game the system, to buy the club back immediately and not inherit any of the debts. And that clearly was an improper way of screwing over local creditors, HMRC, and other parties. So the football industry, aware of the degree of scrutiny that was introduced, or that it was subject to, decided to introduce these rules that said that there would be sporting penalties. If we take a look at Queen's Park Rangers were promoted in 2014 on the back of a bit of shenanigans, is the only way I can describe it, with regards to debts being written off by the owners that were being treated as quasi-income. They were subject to financial penalties. So Everton are saying, well, QPR only got to the Premier League due to a breach of FFP, to a breach of financial rules. So you can understand that from Everton's point of view. Leicester City and Bournemouth, again, both promoted. There were issues to do with their finances. They were given financial sanctions. So why not Everton? If we look at the most recent cases in respect of FFP, we've got Birmingham City. They were given a 9-point deduction by the Premier League, but by the EFL. But I think what is very noticeable here is that the commission who were reviewing the Birmingham City case did have a very strict set of guidance notes given to them by the EFL, which says if you breach the rules by this much, I think it's an X point penalty plus for each £1.5 million extra each £2 million above the limit, a further point, and then you had aggregating and mitigating factors. So there were some guidance notes. Why on earth has the Premier League never got round to that until August 2023? It's a classic case of stable door horse has not just bolted; it's emigrated. In the case of UEFA have attempted to ban clubs for breaches of financial fair play rules. And remember, Manchester City initially were given a 2-year ban from UEFA competition, and we have seen other clubs being given bans as well. So there is no definitive way of saying there is comparable activities, because financial fair play only came into existence in 2013, and this is the first case that has been held with regards to those particular types of charges. I mean, I read Martin Samuel's article as well, and I agreed with some of it, and I didn't agree with other parts of it. For the sake of transparency, for some reason, Martin Samuel doesn't seem to like me, given that he's commented. I've never met the guy, but he's made a few comments. Well, yeah, Philly boots, mate. But with regards to the central premise of financial fair play, in any other industry, an owner can come in and put as much money as they desire. Is there a case for saying that should be the same in football? Well, there is a case for saying that, and I think that would be a spectacular case of be careful what you wish for, because it then does become whoever's got the biggest sugar daddy becomes the most successful club in football. And it does reduce competitive balance, both domestically. You've also got that issue as well. If we're going to have those rules effectively abolished in the UK, how does that impact upon participation in UEFA competitions and so on? So there are cases both for and against. The more you go into it, the more difficult it becomes. Martin Samuel's headline is the Premier League has made accountants and lawyers stars. I don't think it has. I think it's made them scapegoats to a certain extent, depending upon what side of the fence you are in respect of particular rulings. All that I will say is that when the rules came out for financial fair play, I read them and I came up with 10 schemes on the first night. And I've said this on more than one occasion. I came up with 10 schemes on the first night. This is how I would seek to circumvent the rules. And it then becomes a game of financial fair play, whack-a-mole, willy-waving, whatever you want to call it. And it's whoever's got the most persuasive accountants and lawyers. And that's not football.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend whack-a-mole whilst willy-waving. Which is, I would try and keep those two separate if you possibly could. Although alliteratively, very, very nice. If it's any consolation, Kieran, I don't think Martin Samuels likes me very much, and have met. We have met several times. That's possibly the reason. I think I once sat in his chair in a press room recently. The whole place went really quiet because he's one of the big dogs. I do feel, Kieran, I feel every sympathy for Everton fans, and I was as taken aback by this as they were, to be perfectly honest. In fact, even at the Dulwich gig, which was the night before the penalty was announced, I was saying to anybody who wanted to listen that I didn't think there'd be a points deduction, and if it was, it would be suspended. But Barnsley fans will be very unhappy this week that they've been thrown out of the FA Cup because of an accidental administrative error. It wasn't deliberate, it wasn't malicious, but the rule was broken, and therefore the FA sanctioned them by putting them out of the FA Cup, which is the known punishment for that. So in a way, that's similar to what's happened here, isn't it? I mean, I understand the Everton fans' anger, I understand their bafflement that they feel they're being made an example of, and they're demanding that Man City be made the same example, but you can't get away from the fact, no matter how much the figure is, that they have breached FFP regulations. Whether or not you agree with the punishment, and I don't, but you can't get away from the fact that it's a fairly open and shut case, Kieran, and that we've been talking about the potential for this happening almost since the pod started. Certainly in the last 2 or 3 years, we've had many, many questions about why Everton hadn't been pulled up before, and normally the answer was because the Premier League hadn't put a ceiling on how much you could claim COVID had disrupted your finances.
Yes, yeah. I think there are two separate issues. Three separate. Should we have a set of rules, and are the
Yeah,
present rules fit for purpose? For me, that's questionable
yeah,
because it reinforces the existing gaps between clubs.
yeah.
Secondly, has there been a breach? Yes, there is. Thirdly, what should the penalty be? And I think this is the area which has caused the most controversy. Um, I think it's very much at the top end of what I was expecting. I know that the Premier League were pushing for 12 points.
Yeah.
Um, I'm inclined to go with you. I would have had a lower penalty and a suspended penalty. I.e., you're on our naughty step. You've got to be seen to be taking that into consideration as you go forward over the course of the next 12 to 24 months. So that's why, my personal. But at the same time, I've not seen all of the evidence. I don't think. And we talk about Everton, and the fans will say, well, if you talk about Everton, you're talking about us. So here I'm going to say, if you take a look at some of the comments in that report, it's very much directed towards the executives, the people who put together both the accounts and the PSR calculations. If you are using words such as misleading, and that is included in the Independent Commission report, when it was said that Boris Johnson misled the House of Commons, when Boris Johnson misled the Queen, it's a polite way of saying they lied, and that's not helped. I think if Everton had been a bit more proactive and says, yeah, we acknowledge, and again, this comes down to the executives, and many of those executives are not there at the club. So again, it seems harsh that the people who are presenting the case on behalf of Everton were not able to get the comments from the people who were involved at the time. And there's been a lot of bad decisions made at that club. Again, the fans haven't made those decisions.
We have plenty of questions today, Kieran, about other clubs. The first two are both very interesting questions about Manchester United. And the first of those comes from Ryan Trainer Smith. Ryan says there was a furore about sporting integrity when it looked like Qatar might own Manchester United as well as PSG. But hasn't this principle already been broken with multi-club models like City Football Group and Tony Bloom? Yeah, exactly. Quite right, Ryan. For example, Brighton and Union Saint-Gilloise, who are second in their league, could very plausibly meet in Europe in the next few years, please God, no. Is this because of the size of the clubs involved and not the actual damage it would do to sporting integrity? It's a fair question, Kieran, isn't it?
It is a fair question. I don't think Tony Bloom expected Brighton to be in Europe. As a Brighton fan, I didn't expect Brighton to be in Europe. And UEFA investigated Tony Bloom's relationship with those two clubs and has brought in rules. And this was also applied to Aston Villa and their owners. Tony Bloom has now had to divest of his interest in USG. Brighton are not allowed to sign players or to loan players to USG. So UEFA are taking this harsh, I think significantly. We've not seen it at other clubs to the same extent. I think Watford and Udinese, where we've had 20 transactions, and we've commented upon that. There doesn't appear to be an appetite from the domestic legislators. UEFA here, I think, are probably one step ahead. There's a much broader issue going forwards, in my opinion, with regards to what are FIFA going to do, because Manchester City do own clubs. We've got the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund, which owns Newcastle, owns 4 clubs in Saudi Arabia. But what happens if Al Hilal and Newcastle are drawn together in the FIFA World Club Championship? Knowing Gianni Infantino in the way that we do, he will no doubt come up with some long-winded speech which will justify whatever he chooses to justify.
Well, my dad always had a theory about that. You see, with the FA Cup, for example, they always thought it was very easy to keep teams apart. You just heated some of the balls. And then, so, whoever it was, Pat Jennings would put his hand in the velvet bag and go, oh, that's a hot ball, that's Man United. We'll keep that one in there until such time as a third division club is available at home. The multi-club, again, this is going to be a question that we get asked again and again because our guests last week, Josh Charalambos, lawyer specialising in football investment, pointed out that by far the biggest trend at the moment is I think something like 60%. I can't remember the exact question of potential takeovers in Europe last season were as part of multi-club deals. So this is an area that's only going to be causing more complications for UEFA and FIFA in future, isn't it?
You're absolutely right, and Josh was superb guest, and I certainly learnt a lot, and reinforced some of my existing. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a pretty laid back person, but my feeling of discomfort in relation to the expansion of MCOs and also the motives behind them from some of the organisations concerned.
Oh, you sound like one of those people who think the Americans are going to come in and scrap relegation and make us all franchises. We'll be the Crystal Palace. Oh, isn't it? Crystal Palace Cowboys. Yeah, that'd be all right, wouldn't it? I wouldn't mind Crystal Palace Cowboys.
You double glow. Well, it used to be Glazers. I know a few double Cowboys who are double the Glazers.
Very good. Excellent. Obviously, I was thinking of a few for Brighton there, but we are a family show, so I think we'll leave it. We'll leave it there.
The Brighton Chip Stealers.
Sal Busa has another question regarding Manchester United. And Sal says, what happens once a takeover is complete at Man United? Would the new owner simply acquire the shares the Glazers own currently at an agreed price per share? Would the new owners, given they may not be American, be required to keep the club on the New York Stock Exchange? Is there any way they'd be able to take it back to being private and not a publicly listed company? I presume, Kieran, if the deal happens is the Ratcliffe deal for 25%, then these questions are rendered redundant. But I think they're good questions anyway.
Well, I think Manchester United will still be quoted on the New York Stock Exchange, even if Jim Ratcliffe does acquire 25%. So we'll just try to unpack those questions in time. Would the new owner simply acquire the shares the Glazers own currently at an agreed price per share? From what we are hearing, the Manchester United board were genuinely fearful of a lawsuit coming from other shareholders if the only people who are allowed to sell shares to Jim Ratcliffe would have been the Glazer family themselves. So it would now appear that there's going to be a combo offer put forwards. So we will expect to see that. Now, the price that's being quoted in the media is around about $32 a share, which I find a bit strange, given that the market price at present is $18, and we've not seen a surge in the price in respect to that. So I'm treating that with a degree of caution. As far as the club still being allowed to trade on the New York Stock Exchange, that should be fine. Manchester United is registered in the Cayman Islands. So if it gets acquired by Jim Ratcliffe, who is not quite sure where he's based, and again, that's a broader issue. Are the shares being acquired by Jim Ratcliffe in a personal capacity, or are they being acquired by Ineos? But because it's only a minority acquisition, there's no reason why a Cayman Islands registered organisation or a UK or a Monaco registered organisation cannot itself be quoted on the New York Stock Exchange. Is there any way they will be able to take it back to being private? Yeah, you just put in an offer for all of the shares. I mean, that's what Sheikh Jassim was purported to be doing, buying 100% of the shares. And if you own 100% of the shares, there's nothing to be traded on the New York Stock Exchange. So the company automatically becomes delisted.
How many other shareholders that aren't Glazers are there, Kieran?
There's 160 million shares in total. The Glazers own 70% of that. So right. 7/16 is what, 64 plus 48, that's what, 112. So it's probably about 48 million shares in the public domain. So a significant number.
Sorry, what would be gained by stopping those people selling those shares, Kieran?
The gain to Jim Ratcliffe is it works out a lot cheaper.
Okay.
Because he's only buying a quarter of the shares. The gain to the Glazers is that they, in my view, both spectacularly have their cake and eat it, in the sense that, first of all, they get a load of money. Secondly, any upward movement in Manchester United, they've still got a significant number of shares, so therefore they're going to benefit from the increase in the value of Manchester United. And thirdly, if anything goes wrong at Manchester United, they say, well, look, Jim Ratcliffe's in charge of the football. It's nothing to us. We're just a bunch of American investors. We don't understand the game anymore. We never understood the game. That's why we gave it to the Limeys. So that's the position. It's cheaper. But also Avram and Joel Glazer don't want to sell all of their shares because they are convinced that the football club is hugely undervalued by both the US markets and the world in general.
I remember going to visit a mate of mine, Kieran, who was coaching in very far upstate New York, which turns out to be surprisingly redneck out in the rural bits near the Canadian border. And there was a few of us English people out there, and it's one American chap was absolutely furious when he kept calling us limeys and we kept not being annoyed by it. Right. And I had to explain to him that I said, well, I think three of the people here have got no idea what limey means, and also, in the great scheme of things, being compared to a citrus fruit isn't that insulting, to be perfectly honest, mate. There's loads of things you can shout about us English people, really, but...
Yes. Yeah, not mentioned our teeth for a start.
Exactly,
so we'll take the citrus fruit.
Yeah, but finding a cure for scurvy 200 years ago, that's not the most insulting. It turns out, Kieran, we have a third question on Manchester United, and it comes from Connor Griffiths. And Connor's question is this: as and when the Man United takeover goes ahead, how much tax revenue will be generated, if any? And is there any legal mechanism to force the payment of any tax on the sale of the club?
Right. As far as the UK exchequer is concerned, the likelihood is there's going to be no tax benefits.
None.
And the reason for this is that ultimately it's going to be a private sale of shares from one person to another. The vast majority of Manchester United shares are owned either by the Glazer family or by investment funds. I think the likes of there's an organisation called Lindsay Train, and there's a few others that own significant percentages of the shares which are traded on the New York Exchange. So if they sell their shares at a profit, then they would be subject to what's referred to as capital gains tax in the USA, and you'd probably, as long as you've held the shares for at least a year, you'd end up paying 20% on the profit. So if you bought a share for $10 and you sold it for 18, that's an $8 profit. 20% of that, it's $1.60 tax per share that you sold.
Okay. Nick Phillips has an interesting question, Kieran. Nick says, I've been using the Livescore app for a couple of years and find it is very useful for stats and keeping up to date with multiple live matches. I've also noticed that they have a betting arm called Livescore Bet. Is this business primarily a gambling enterprise, or is the match update service a business that could survive without the gambling side?
Yeah, I use that app as well. It is a good app. If we take a look at the Livescore group, which itself is a subsidiary of a company called Anzo. Anzo, I believe, is based in Jersey, so where we were a couple of weeks ago. Livescore and Livescore Bet are separate, but it's the same logo and so on. Looking at the breakdown of revenues, I would say probably 80% of the revenues are generated by Livescore Bet, which also owns Virgin Bet, and probably around about 20% is generated from advertising, and the advertising mainly comes through the Livescore app. It's a new company. It's very much a startup. It's losing £1 million a week, so it is reliant upon funding. What makes me feel slightly uncomfortable is that if you take a look at Livescore Bet in particular, it's got companies based in Gibraltar, Malta, Nigeria, the Czech Republic, Austria, places where corporate governance tends to be slightly more cloudy. And also the attitudes towards gambling and so on, slightly more relaxed than here in the UK. So That's not necessarily great in my view. And the people connected with the companies, they'll say, well, we can set up wherever we want. Absolutely, you can do whatever you want. But I've often referred to Caesar's wife. It's good to look to be transparent. It's good to be, if we got gambling, we do have a gambling commission in the UK. It's more difficult to deal with organisations which are spread across a myriad of countries.
Mm. Next question, Kieran, comes from friend of the show, Stuart Hatcher. Stuart says, what anti-money laundering rules do football clubs have to comply with, and what sanctions would they get if they breached them? It's an interesting question, Kieran, given the huge amounts of money that Premier League clubs are swapping in transactions twice a year, basically, in the transfer windows.
Yes, so I looked at a recent report into money laundering in football, and I quote directly. It said, "Professional football's complex organisation and lack of transparency have created a fertile ground for the use of illegal resources. Questionable sums of money with no apparent or explicable financial return or gain are being invested in the sport." That's quite a damning comment.
Yeah.
So, does money laundering take place in football? Yes, it does. We are both aware of one club which was being utilised by somebody for money laundering purposes. For legal reasons, we cannot name that club, of course. What are the rules?
Unless, Kieran, you come to one of our live gigs, in which I imagine you'd only be too happy to name that club.
Can't possibly comment.
No.
So what are the rules that football clubs should be applying? Because they could be subject to scrutiny. And remember, we have seen in respect of the Premier League itself, in terms of the owners and directors test, that is a form of doing due diligence in respect of background and money laundering. The EFL have certainly upped their game as well. As far as what the club should be doing in respect of transactions, they should be doing due diligence because these are £1 million plus transactions. They should be reporting any suspicious activity. So they should be self-reporting. Effectively, we're saying that if you are a multi-million-pound organisation, then you should have some form of compliance department, which is saying, let's just check that we are in accordance with the rules. You should have a risk management strategy, and that should be embedded into the governance of the club, and so on. So there are no specific rules that you see in sort of the Premier League handbook or the EFL handbook, but there is a broader set of compliance with international transactions. The only trouble with that is it doesn't tend to cover domestic money laundering issues, which may or may not exist.
Okay. By which I'm assuming you're implying they do. No, silent.
Yeah,
nothing.
You might infer. That doesn't mean that I imply.
You went full Mount Rushmore on me there, Kieran. It's very good. Moving on, you're on to the next witness. Paul Glover has this question, Kieran. Thank you, Paul. Paul Glover says, do owners ever take a salary from their club, or do they only take dividends?
Very rarely do owners take dividends. Dividends are given to shareholders. Now, I think Manchester United, we've taken up a fair amount of this show. They famously paid quite significant dividends between 2016 and 2021, around about £22 million a year. Those went to the Glazers and other shareholders. It's been a very rare occurrence elsewhere. I think Swansea City, it happened. But when it comes to salaries, there are quite a few owners. There was when Blackpool got to the Premier League, and famously their wage bill in the Premier League appeared to be lower than their wage bill in the Championship in terms of getting to the Premier League. Somebody whose surname was involved the word Oyston took out around about £11 million as a salary. Or as a payment. We have seen people such as Ken Anderson, who is the former owner of Bolton Wanderers, and has been associated in the last few days with a potential bid at Reading Football Club. I think it's fair to say I'm not particularly keen on that. Bolton Wanderers fans, I think, and Reading fans have been in communication. They will know the reason why. He said, I've never paid myself a dividend or a salary, and that is indeed correct. He did, however, pay himself £625,000 as a consultancy fee, and his son, Lee Anderson, was also paid £125,000 for services to the club. And and to be fair, there's a very nice picture of Lee Anderson wearing a Bolton Wanderers tracksuit, wandering past a chip shop. And it could be that he's doing it as for marketing the new kit. That could be the case. So people are taking money out, not necessarily as dividends, through other means. Some owners, Steve Parish at Palace, he's taken out substantial sums, not in the early years of his ownership, but in recent years, he's taken out seven-figure sums from the club in the form of a salary. You look at what's happened at West Ham when David Gold and David Sullivan, they both lent the club money. And what they did, they say, again, we've not taken out dividends, we've not taken out money in the form of salaries, but we have paid ourselves £20 million in interest over the period of the loan. So there are a variety of routes through which owners can extract money from the club. They can rent premises to the club. Okay, I'm not having a go at Steve Parish, but that's what he does, as you're aware, through his club, his company, Smoke and Mirrors Group. So if you want to get money out of the club, there are ways and means. Or you can simply go to the club secretary on a Tuesday night and demand that they empty the safe and give you the contents of the safe. I can't remember which former owner of which club, and I can't remember how many years he was banned from football, but that's one that comes to mind as well.
Yeah, I can't. What was his name? I keep thinking itsy bitsy teeny weeny yellow polka dot. I should point out to people listening to this, by the way, that Steve Parish's group is actually called the Smoke and Mirrors. That's the name of his company. Kieran wasn't dropping any hints there about Steve Parish's business.
No.
And also,
I think it's a gag. I think it's a good gag.
It's a gag, Kieran. Let's agree. Let's leave it there. So, as a comedy professional, let's leave it as it's a gag and not make value judgments about whether or not it's good or bad. And to be fair to the Andersons, I understand that the price of fish has gone through the roof lately, so it's quite possible that £125,000 was simply buying 10 cod and chips, basically, at an upmarket fish and chip shop. So I don't know if the price of fish can go through the roof. Really, it seems a bit. Anyway. Our next question.
New podcast there. The price of fish.
Think of the puns. Sorry, I couldn't catch that, Kieran. It's a bit hard of hearing. Lordy. It's got a terrible headache. Anyway.
Bye, BAFTA.
Oh, that's gone long ago. I've put something else on the shelf now. I've got a statue of Smudge on the shelf now. I'm not going to get anything else put there, are we? Our next question comes from Rory Woods. I did initially plan to suggest that Rory Woods' dad probably really likes golf, but then I realised that you don't choose your surname, do you? Unless he loves golf so much that he changed his surname to Woods by deed poll. But Rory Woods has a question. Again, this is an area that our listeners have always interested in. Rory wants to know, how does the Premier League TV deal break down around the world and how are they negotiated? For instance, the rights would surely be worth more in the UK than, say, Cambodia. So does the Premier League have a minimum amount they need to achieve to provide an international broadcaster with the rights, or is it purely an auction to the highest bidder? And if it is an auction, is there anything to stop collusion locally to essentially secure rights at low price? I'm particularly interested in that part of Rory's question. Does the Premier League have a minimum amount or they need to achieve, or is it actually just goes to the highest bidder, whatever the bid?
What will tend to be the case is that the Premier League will put out bids for individual markets to tender. and there will be a minimum tender price. And they will say, because we don't want to devalue the overall product, if you cannot meet the minimum tender price, then that particular geographical market will have to go without the Premier League. We've seen the French TV, the French football authorities do that domestically, and there was a genuine danger that we could, if you're a French viewer, you could end up with nothing to watch because the Canal Plus and others have said we're not overly keen on the product at present. So that is to protect, and also we know that some countries are geographically quite close to one another. So if it turned out that the Cambodian rights were sold off very cheaply, and here I'm going to show my spectacular ignorance of Southeast Asian geography, does it mean that if you're in Vietnam or if you're in Laos or if you're in other countries which are close by, it could be that you can get them cheaper using a dodgy box from the next country. So if Cambodia was selling them off dirt cheap, it could mean that people in Laos and Vietnam will say, well, we won't pay for our domestic broadcaster, we'll get them from Cambodia itself. So in order to protect, I think, the overall value of the market, the Premier League will say there's a minimum amount that we're prepared to accept. That minimum amount tends to be met because the Premier League is a fantastically addictive product as far as subscribers are concerned. I think there's only 4 or 5 countries in the world that don't have Premier League rights, and that includes Cuba and Afghanistan under the Taliban, and North Korea. So it's a pretty niche market. Is there anything to stop collusion locally to ensure rights at a low price? Not really. And again, trying to police that, I think, would be difficult for the Premier League because you have to have lawyers involved in every market. But again, what I would say is if there is collusion, ultimately the rights are given to one bidder as opposed to another, and there's going to be a winner and a loser. So you'd have to have a lot of collusion to make that worthwhile to the loser of the rights.
David McCutcheon has our next question. I think this is a really interesting one, Kieran, and it's sort of relevant to the Everton case. David McCutcheon says, with so many lawsuits flying around in British football, can you advise at which point clubs listed on the stock market would have to note in their accounts that a huge bill is potentially around the corner? And if a club didn't do that, would it be against FPFL or English Premier League rules?
Right. First of all, it doesn't matter whether you're a listed company or not. If you are a company and you have produced your accounts using what's referred to as UK GAAP, which is generally accepted accounting principles, there is something in the world of accounting called a contingent liability. A contingent liability is an amount of money that you may or may not have to pay in the future, which is awaiting as an unyet resolved event. So you've got to wait for the legal case to be heard or a settlement to be made. Now, if you expect to lose the case, you put that sum through your accounts. If you think there is a possibility of you losing that case, you then stick that particular issue in the footnotes. So if we take a look at the Manchester City 2023 accounts, Manchester City makes specific reference as a contingent liability to the fact that they are being investigated by the Premier League. They may have some financial or sporting sanctions as a result. They also say, because we think we're going to win the case, we've not stuck that amount in the accounts. If you take a look at Manchester United and Newcastle United and some other clubs, historically, they've been subject to investigations by HMRC with regards to amounts being paid to image rights companies. Those cases have not necessarily been resolved. So therefore, again, they say, well, we might have to pay out an amount of money. We haven't actually got a clue what it's going to be. And that sort of, it deals on a broader issue, because you'll also find in the accounts of what I would refer to as better prepared clubs, is they do exactly the same with potential payments in respect of add-ons for transfer fees, bonuses to players, and so on when certain goals are achieved. And the amounts that we're talking about here can run into tens and sometimes hundreds of millions of pounds.
I like that word, betterly. That's a good Homer Simpson word, betterly.
Yes, that's where I got that one from.
Betterly prepared sounds better than better prepared, doesn't it? I'm intrigued, Kieran. I've heard you mention the gap thing before. Generally accepted accountancy practice. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but are they guidelines in the accountancy practice, or are they legal outlines? So, when you say that's best practice, are there people that just go, well, that's fine, that's best practice, that doesn't necessarily mean I have to adhere to them?
Well, you don't have to adhere to them if you can prove that by not adhering to them, you are better representing the state of affairs of the club to all of the stakeholders. However, if your club is being audited and the auditors will say, well, look, you've not applied this part of the rules in relation to transfer fees, or this part of the rules in respect to amortization, for example, therefore we're not going to sign off the accounts. Yeah, that is the possible downside that a club might have to deal with. Any accountant worth their salt should know the rules, and therefore, from a professional point of view, if you're seen to be signing off if you're a finance director who's a qualified accountant and you've deliberately chosen not to apply the rules, you potentially could be on the back of sort of some form of professional disciplinary hearing.
Okay. We end this pod, Kieran, on what I can only describe as a dangerous precedent. We're stepping into uncharted waters here, Kieran, and I'm not entirely sure I want to step into these waters. I'm not entirely sure whether these stepping stones I'm putting my trainers on are ready to take my weight, Kieran. But it's written down. Producer guy's written down. It says 2 questions from Raphael Better, and then in brackets, both so good they also both made the cut. PG, which is producer guy's friendly way of referring to himself when he talks to the minions. PG, both good, so both made the cut. Now, I mean, that's a value judgment. They are good questions, but I think what a slap in the face, Kieran, for the people, the thousands of people that are on our waiting list who can't even get one question asked, who have got through to the end of this pod and doing what they do every week with their fingers crossed, saying please, please, possibly even putting a rosary bead if they're from the same background as us, saying please, please, let this be the week my question on amortization is asked, and no. 2 questions, they're both from the same person. So I want all our listeners to know this is producer Guy who's enforcing this precedent on us. And poor old Raphael now is sitting at home thinking, oh, please let these questions go down well. It's like when you're trying out new jokes, you think, please let there be some sort of laugh. So anyway, Raphael's first question. It's a good question, Kieran. I'm not gainsaying that. But it's the first of 2, Kieran. This is other podcasts don't do this. I'm sure. I'm sure little Josh Widdicombe and little Robbie Beckett don't have the same 2 questions about how annoying their toddler is in a row from the same person. I'm sure Jack D doesn't have the same question about toilet training your puppy, which doesn't exist, from the same person twice in a row. This is outrageous. So anyway, Raphael, your first question. You have recently shared with us, says Raphael, what happens when a player gets injured and who actually pays for their medical bills. I was wondering, though, what happens in the case of a failed transfer. I assume the buying club pays the fee to bring out the player for medical discussions and so on. But what happens if the transfer just doesn't go through? Who pays for the return leg back home? The selling club will be unhappy to fork out money for a player who potentially wanted to leave, and the buying club is no longer interested for whatever reason. So do they send them back in coach, which indicates that Raphael is American, I understand, or do they fly them out on a private jet? Finally, do players ever pay for anything themselves? Well, I think we all know the answer to that question, Raphael. But
Well, sometimes players do. What was the name of that player who I think he was at Stoke and Spurs were interested in him, and he drove himself down?
He did. He stayed in the car park overnight while waiting for the transfer deadline to tick by, wondering why the Sky cameras were packing up without coming to interview him.
Yes. It would be the obligation of the buying club. The buying club makes an offer to the selling club, and therefore this would be deemed to be part of the overall cost of recruitment of the player, and that would include a two-way ticket. Whilst I quite like the idea of a player arriving, goes through the medical, or his agent says, "Well, I want 150 grand a week," and the buyer says, "Not on your Nelly," and they just walk out the room, and the player's going, "What we're supposed to be doing next?"
You can make your own way home. It's 1:45 on January 31st. You can make your own way. The last train to Thornton Heath is just gone, mate. You have to get an Uber. Off you go. It's hilarious.
Yeah, I think the buying club would suffer severe reputational damage within the industry by taking such an approach. So it tends to use private jets if you can get hold of them, and of course our friend Chloe,
Indeed,
she sort of spoke to us through the process that would happen there, and quite often clubs have jets on standby, and they hope that the medical doesn't take too long because the pilot has a limited number of hours, and you can't. I don't think you can do overtime as pilots. It's one of those jobs where, because of the potential repercussions if things don't work out, you'd have to be very strict. So there can be a lot of complications involved. As much as I really like sort of a planes, trains, and automobiles route home, it's very much the obligation of the buying club.
I'm not technical, Kieran, so I don't know how long our podcasts stay available for. But our friend Chloe, that
forever.
Forever. Okay, well, yes. Those of you who don't know or are new to the pod, our friend Chloe is Chloe Horrocks, who arranges the travel for the Manchester United first team squad, both men and women. I think I'm on the safe ground. She'd say she's a proper mank, Kieran.
Absolutely, yeah.
And and when she did the live show, I discovered that she has a glare that Paddington Bear would be very, very proud of. When asked a question that I'd absolutely promised I wouldn't ask her, and then completely forgot and asked her. But the interview she did with us was absolutely fascinating. So if you want to look out for that episode, one with Chloe Horrocks, then I urge you to do so. The second question from Raphael Better, I like Raphael's first question, and I'm not going to be cheap enough to go, but this one is better, Raphael. Obviously, but I did like even better. Very good. I did like your first question, Raphael. This one I did particularly like because, as you know, Kieran, I always like the sort of question that sounds like it's the result of 3 or 4 people sitting around a pub table around about 10:30 at night when they think, well, we should go home, but I don't really want to go home yet. Well, but it's a cracking question. And Raphael's second question is, what's stopping an extremely wealthy fan from going to their club's website and buying enough shirts to pump up the club's profits and get the better of FFP rules? They could then donate the shirts to a third world country, increasing the support for the club too. This seems like a win-win-win situation in my eyes. And I think I'm going to hazard a guess, Kieran, that the answer is there's nothing stopping an extremely wealthy fan doing that, because we have had rumours about extremely wealthy owners in particular, buying boxes for themselves and for friends. So what's the answer to this obviously pub question?
As you know, I don't drink, so I don't really understand these things. I presume this is not a pint number one question either.
Oh, no.
Is that fair to assume?
No. Pint number one, you're getting it. Basically, you're getting how's the family out of the way. Basically, pint number one. Pint number two, because we're all encouraged to talk to each other as middle-aged men these days. So you do a bit of, you okay if you're all right at work? You're not really interested, but you feel that you should ask. And pint number three is general football chat. This is a pint 4 question, Kieran, I would say. This is a pint 4, verging on pint 5 even, actually. But let's be generous and say this is a pint 4 question.
Right. Okay. Fantastic question, Raphael. Absolutely nothing to stop a club
There you
from
go.
doing this, or an extremely wealthy fan. All I would say, it's not the most efficient way.
Yeah.
Given that most clubs are probably only on a 7% commission. So you buy an £80 shirt and the club's making an extra £5.60. Yeah, if you want to get £1 million into the club, you've got to sell 450,000 shirts. I think Adidas and Nike and Puma and the other manufacturers were going, blimey O'Reilly, that's a bit of a long run.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, a bunch of somewhat startled kids in Gibraltar go, Jesus, we've just got 450,000 Coventry City football shirts. What on earth are we going to do with them, or whoever the club might be?
Yeah. Not to mention the poor sod in the club shop who's, imagine if the wealthy fan's name was Papadopoulos and he wants 450,000 of them with the name printed on the back. So I've got to go at R5. Thank you to everyone who's donated to the pod via our Patreon page. If you'd like to make a small monthly contribution to the pod as well, that'd be very kind of you. You can do so by going to patreon.com/priceoffootball, and it will get you access to our chat community and our regular quizzes. And the next of our chats is on Tuesday, the 28th of November, which is this Tuesday coming at 7:30 p.m. So that's a Discord session for our ultras only. So I believe that will cost you £5 a month to take part in that, but they're always very lively and very interesting. If you have a question you'd like answered on the show and your name's not Raphael Better, then email us at questions@priceoffootball.com, as I think, Raphael, you may have used up all your goes. Unless, of course, you know something about Producer Guy we don't know, and you have the photographs. We'd love to see them. Kieran and I are going to be in Hastings in December for an event for East Sussex Libraries. It's on Wednesday the 13th, and we'll be talking about our new book and discussing a few pressing football finance matters for good measure too. You'll also get to meet us both, which is quite easily done, I have to say. You can grab a copy of the book if you haven't already got one, or if you have, we'll sign it for you. Tickets are free but very limited, so if any of you fancy a night out in Hastings, and I'm not going to read out the next bit because it started a debate about how far away we are from 1066. Somebody accused me of my maths not being very good, which, again, it's like being called a limey. You can call me a lot of things, but telling me my maths isn't very good is water off a duck's back. But if you want to come along, it'll be a chance for you to meet two very good friends of mine, the Palace fans. Young Jack Pearce, who's organising the event, and James Endicott, legendary James Endicott, ex-bass player for The Loop, the man who brought the Libertines to fame, the man with the best stories in the world. He's down there. He'll be there, the Ginger Viking. So it's worth getting a ticket just to meet the Ginger Viking, to be perfectly honest. So you can do that by clicking the link in the show and register for your ticket. If you'd like to buy our latest book or one of our other books, get yourself a Price of Football t-shirt. You can find details on our website, priceoffootball.com. We'll be back on Thursday with our regular news pod. In the meantime, I shall hand you over to Mr. Kieran Maguire for his customary farewell.
Well, thank you as always for those people that have been interacting with us, correcting our mathematical and geographical errors, of which I am guilty very much of the latter.
We're going to get a lot of tweets from Southeast Asia, Kieran. That's all I'm saying.
We are hungry. And also, there's people at Patreon. Remember, if you want to have an ad-free version of the show, Patreon members can opt for that. There's other ways to support the show, and that's to give us a review. If you want to give us a review for the book, those of you that have read it, that helps us with our very good friends at Amazon and other publishers, of course. And you can also give us a review of the podcast by whatever app you use to listen to it. And it doesn't matter what you say. And we're recording this on Sunday, and it is a sad day for football. So I'm going to say, if you'd like to say, you'd rather have it presented by my two favourite Terrys, and I say this as a Brighton fan who's not necessarily a Crystal Palace fan, Terry Venables, and of course, my own Uncle Terry, God rest his soul.
Well, that would be a chatty one, wouldn't it?
They're both it would be very chatty, and I suspect if you did a Venn diagram, they'd have some friends in common.
I imagine they would. I think for all that Terry Venables' career at Palace as a manager ended under a cloud, he brought us some very, very happy times at Selhurst Park. He was responsible for some wonderful football both as a player and a manager. Probably for Palace fans my age, apart from the semi-final in 1990, that Friday night in 1979, when I'm going to say 120,000 people were in Selhurst Park. Officially, it says 55,000, but it's he will be sadly missed by all in football. And of course, he didn't get on very well with Alan Mullery, so I was always inclined to like him. Always inclined to like him. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
The price of football. The price of football.